Imagine waking up one day to a world without friction. No hunger, no danger, no struggle. Every need met before it even surfaces in your mind. Warmth when you're cold, coolness when you're hot, soft words when you're anxious, and endless entertainment when you're bored. At first it feels like paradise, the kind of life humanity has dreamed of since its earliest days. But then slowly, an unease begins to grow. You notice how heavy your limbs feel, not from work, but from inertia. Your thoughts seem dulled, your instincts softened. The fire that once burned behind your eyes begins to flicker. Something vital is slipping away, yet you can't name it. You're comfortable, but strangely empty. Friedrich Nietzsche foresaw this world long before it arrived. He called it the age of the last man, an era in which human beings would trade greatness for ease, passion for security, and meaning for comfort. He wasn't simply making a cultural critique, he was issuing a warning about the deepest mechanics of the soul. Comfort, he suggested, does not just soothe pain, it dissolves the very will to transcend it. It robs life of its gravity, leaving a hollow shell where a striving spirit once was. But here's the paradox. The very thing we have been taught to pursue, security, stability, the removal of suffering, might be the very thing that makes us weaker. We tend to believe that happiness is the absence of hardship, yet Nietzsche suggests the opposite, that hardship is the soil from which vitality, creativity, and even joy grow. Without it, the human spirit atrophies like an unused muscle. So what happens when a society begins to perfect comfort, when every challenge is engineered away, every rough edge smoothed, every hunger instantly satisfied? Do we become more free, or more dependent, more alive, or more docile? We say we want liberation, but what if the velvet cushion of modern life is actually a cage? You can feel this tension in your own life if you look closely. Think about the times when you felt most alive, not entertained, not distracted, but truly alive. Chances are, those moments were not the easiest ones. They were moments of risk, effort, even pain. The hours spent struggling toward a goal, the vulnerability of confessing your true feelings, the long night before a decisive leap into the unknown. Strangely, we look back on those moments with gratitude, even reverence. Yet our daily routines are designed to eliminate precisely those experiences. Nietzsche believed this was not merely a personal issue, but an existential one for humanity. When we arrange our lives to avoid suffering at all costs, we also avoid the transformation suffering can bring. In his view, greatness, whether moral, artistic, or spiritual, emerges only in the presence of resistance. Take that away, and you don't get a peaceful utopia. You get a population of the last men, safe, comfortable, and profoundly mediocre. But perhaps the most unsettling question is not about society at large, but about you. How much of your life is shaped by the pursuit of comfort? How many decisions, small and large, are guided by the quiet desire to avoid discomfort, to keep things easy, predictable, pleasant? And what has that pursuit cost you, in vitality, in courage, in self-respect? If Nietzsche is right, then comfort is not neutral. It is a force that reshapes your soul, gently eroding the qualities that make you capable of depth and greatness. The trap is that it feels good while it does it. It seduces rather than coerces, offering you relief from struggle even as it strips you of the very strength you would need to resist it. And so the great question arises, is comfort the enemy of freedom? Is it possible that the life you think you want, the safe life, the easy life, is actually the life that will leave you hollow? If so, what would it mean to live differently, to deliberately embrace the very discomfort you've been taught to avoid? This is where Nietzsche's warning begins, not as an abstract idea, but as a mirror held up to your own choices. And as you look into it, you might start to see a stranger looking back. The first sign of a trap is that you don't feel trapped. In a comfortable world, the bars of the cage are invisible because they are padded. You're not being starved, you're being fed. You're not being coerced, you're being soothed. This is why Nietzsche's warning strikes so deep. The danger of comfort is not obvious pain, but subtle erosion. The soft tyranny of ease does not crush you, it dissolves you. Why is this so? Why does comfort, something we have been taught to revere, carry such a corrosive potential? To answer this, we must go beneath the surface, into the architecture of the human psyche itself. Carl Jung observed that the human mind is not built for endless stasis. We are a species forged in the crucible of tension, conflict, and uncertainty. Our nervous systems evolved under conditions of risk, not safety, of scarcity, not abundance. Every instinct within you, from your dopamine circuits to your dreams, is calibrated for a world where survival required struggle. When that struggle disappears, the machinery of your mind does not simply shut off, it begins to malfunction. Think about the phenomenon of learned helplessness described by psychologist Martin Seligman. When animals are subjected to pain without the ability to act, they eventually stop trying to escape. Even when escape becomes possible, a strange passivity sets in. Now invert this. What happens when human beings are subjected not to pain but to constant ease without effort? We stop developing the inner muscles needed to act. We become psychologically flaccid. We mistake passivity for peace. Nietzsche intuited this long before the research existed. He warned of the last man who blinks and says, "We have invented happiness," not realizing he has lost his soul in the process. The last man's defining trait is not misery, but smugness. He is pleased with his comfort and calls it progress. He has no great passions, no burning questions, no risk of despair, because despair requires depth. The last man is shallow enough to be perpetually content and therefore perpetually small. Arthur Schopenhauer, whom Nietzsche both admired and rebelled against, framed suffering as the essence of life. To Schopenhauer, existence was a ceaseless striving of the will, a blind and insatiable force. Nietzsche took this further. Instead of merely resigning himself to suffering, he asked, what if suffering is not just inevitable but necessary? What if it is the very condition for growth, for self-overcoming, for becoming who you are? Without resistance, there is no transformation. Without weight, there is no strength. Yet the modern psyche is conditioned to avoid precisely that. Our culture sells comfort as the highest good, the ergonomic chair, the one-click delivery, the algorithmic feed tailored to your tastes. We confuse convenience with freedom. But as Aldous Huxley foresaw in Brave New World, a society that maximizes comfort risks producing not free citizens but narcotized consumers. You don't need a whip to enslave someone who has been trained to crave sedation. There is a deeper, subtler layer still. Comfort does not merely weaken the will, it distorts the self. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to be free, meaning that we cannot escape the burden of choosing who we are. Discomfort forces you to confront that freedom. When life is hard, you are compelled to act, to define yourself in the face of obstacles. Comfort, by contrast, lets you drift. You become an object among objects, living according to default scripts handed down by society. You may feel safe, but you have ceased to be the author of your own life. Viktor Frankl, writing from the abyss of the concentration camps, made a similar point. Even in the most inhuman conditions, he argued, a person can find meaning through the stance they take towards suffering. Meaning is not given, it is forged. But in a world without visible suffering, the very question of meaning evaporates. If you never have to stand against anything, if you never have to wrestle with fate, how will you discover who you are? And yet here lies the great seduction. Comfort feels like liberation. The absence of pain feels like the presence of freedom. You're told you're lucky to live in an age of convenience, and in many ways you are. But Nietzsche's warning is that this is not the whole truth. Beneath the smooth surface, something ancient in you is dying, the instinct to strive, to transcend, to endure and transform. Without realizing it, you become like a plant grown in a greenhouse, safe from storms, yes, but also stunted, fragile, unprepared for real weather. This is not a call to romanticize suffering or glorify hardship. It is a call to recognize that the avoidance of all discomfort is itself a form of self-imprisonment. Nietzsche's will to power was not about dominating others, but about overcoming oneself, an inner ascent that requires friction, resistance, and risk. In a life stripped of these, the will atrophies. Ask yourself, how many of your choices are made for the sake of ease rather than growth? How often do you settle for the path of least resistance, telling yourself it's just practical or no big deal, without noticing how each choice shapes the architecture of why? Our soul. Each time you choose comfort over courage, you reinforce a habit of shrinking rather than expanding. Over time, that habit becomes your character. This is the hidden problem behind Nietzsche's warning. Comfort is not evil, it is insidious. It masquerades as kindness while quietly reshaping the human spirit. It is not a storm that smashes you, but a slow, warm tide that pulls you out to sea. By the time you realize you're drifting, the shore of your own strength is already far behind you. And so, the question deepens. If comfort is the silent architect of mediocrity, what are its unseen consequences? How does this hidden force not only shape your inner life, but ripple outward into families, communities, and whole civilizations? If the roots of the problem lie deep within the psyche, then its branches may already be shading the entire landscape of modern life. At first, the consequences of comfort are invisible, like a slow poison dissolving in clear water. But over time, they crystallize in behaviors, values, even the architecture of societies. When the instinct to strive is replaced by the instinct to be soothed, the shape of human life changes. We stop building cathedrals and start building malls. We stop dreaming of transcendence and start scrolling for distractions. The horizon of our desires contracts until all that matters is being comfortable today. You can see it in the smallest habits. The instant you reach for your phone in a moment of boredom, you are practicing a micro-ritual of escape. The second you avoid a difficult conversation because it might be uncomfortable, you're training yourself to flee from friction. Each avoidance is tiny and forgettable, but together they weave a pattern, a life designed not for depth but for ease. This is how mediocrity becomes normalized, not through great acts of cowardice, but through 1,000 small surrenders. Neuroscience helps explain why. Our brains evolved to release dopamine not just for pleasure but for progress, for moving toward a goal. When everything is instantly available, the loop breaks. We receive the dopamine without the striving. Over time, motivation circuits dull, attention fragments, and the capacity for long, sustained effort erodes. This isn't just a personal quirk, it's a neurological consequence of a world optimized for convenience. We become creatures of impulse rather than intention. Nietzsche saw a civilizational version of this process. In his image of the last man, the entire culture drifts toward a baseline of safety, predictability, and sameness. No one rocks the boat because there is no boat left to rock. Even art becomes anemic, produced not to awaken, but to pacify. He wrote of a future where people no longer aspire to greatness but to comfort, no longer yearn for challenge, but for entertainment. The result is not a society of villains, but of spectators. This has political consequences. A population trained to value comfort above all else is easy to govern. As long as the stream of conveniences flows, dissent feels unnecessary, even rude. Why risk your job or your reputation for an abstract principle when your fridge is full and your feed is amusing? In this way, the pursuit of comfort becomes a form of soft control, a velvet rope around the public will. Aldous Huxley understood this when he imagined a society pacified not by fear, but by pleasure, lulled into obedience by its own appetites. There are familial consequences too. Children raised without any experience of frustration or risk may grow into adults who lack resilience. When every obstacle is cleared for them, they never develop the muscles of patience, perseverance, or delayed gratification. Psychologists now speak of emotional fragility, not as a moral failing, but as a predictable outcome of overprotection. Nietzsche would have seen this as the breeding ground for the last man, a generation raised to be safe rather than strong. Even our sense of time warps under the reign of comfort. In a world of constant novelty and instant gratification, the slow work of mastery becomes alien. Why spend years apprenticing to a craft when you can get a digital simulacrum in seconds? Yet mastery, whether of art, science, or self, requires friction. It requires staying with difficulty long enough to be transformed by it. Without that, We get products without producers, opinions without thought, identities without struggle. And then there are the existential consequences, the ones Nietzsche cared about most. When life becomes too easy, its meaning becomes elusive. Viktor Frankl warned that meaning is not something you can consume, it is something you must create, often under pressure. If your life contains no pressure, the question, "Why am I here?" becomes harder, not easier, to answer. Comfort solves problems of survival, but amplifies problems of purpose. You may already feel this paradox in your own life. The more comforts you accumulate, the more restless you become. The couch is soft, but your mind is itchy. The entertainment is endless, but you are bored. This is not a failure of willpower. It is the structure of the trap. Comfort satiates the body, but starves the spirit. It gives you everything you thought you wanted, and then whispers that something essential is missing. Left unchecked, this dynamic does not merely produce unhappy individuals, it reshapes entire cultures. Civilizations that lose their appetite for difficulty lose their capacity for greatness. History is full of examples. Empires that became decadent, citizens who traded liberty for bread and circuses, cultures that mistook leisure for vitality. Nietzsche's warning was that modernity might universalize this pattern, not as a cyclical decline, but as a permanent condition. Neuroscience helps explain why. Our brains evolved to release dopamine, not just for pleasure, but for progress, for moving toward a goal. When everything is instantly available, the loop breaks. We receive the dopamine without the striving. Over time, motivation circuits dull, attention fragments, and the capacity for long, sustained effort erodes. This isn't just a personal quirk, it's a neurological consequence of a world optimized for convenience. We become creatures of impulse rather than intention. Nietzsche saw a civilizational version of this process. In his image of the last man, the entire culture drifts toward a baseline of safety, predictability, and sameness. No one rocks the boat because there is no boat left to rock. Even art becomes anemic, produced not to awaken, but to pacify. He wrote of a future where people no longer aspire to greatness but to comfort, no longer yearn for challenge but for entertainment. The result is not a society of villains, but of spectators. This has political consequences. A population trained to value comfort above all else is easy to govern. As long as the stream of conveniences flows, dissent feels unnecessary, even rude. Why risk your job or your reputation for an abstract principle when your fridge is full and your feed is amusing? In this way, the pursuit of comfort becomes a form of soft control, a velvet rope around the public will. Aldous Huxley understood this when he imagined a society pacified not by fear, but by pleasure, lulled into obedience by its own appetites. There are familial consequences too. Children raised without any experience of frustration or risk may grow into adults who lack resilience. When every obstacle is cleared for them, they never develop the muscles of patience, perseverance, or delayed gratification. Psychologists now speak of emotional fragility, not as a moral failing, but as a predictable outcome of overprotection. Nietzsche would have seen this as the breeding ground for the last man, a generation raised to be safe rather than strong. Even our sense of time warps under the reign of comfort. In a world of constant novelty and instant gratification, the slow work of mastery becomes alien. Why spend years apprenticing to a craft when you can get a digital simulacrum in seconds? Yet mastery, whether of art, science, or self, requires friction. It requires staying with difficulty long enough to be transformed by it. Without that, we get products without producers, opinions without thought, identities without struggle. And then there are the existential consequences, the ones Nietzsche cared about most. When life becomes too easy, its meaning becomes elusive. Viktor Frankl warned that meaning is not something you can consume, it is something you must create, often under pressure. If your life contains no pressure, the question, "Why am I here?" becomes harder, not easier, to answer. Comfort solves problems of survival, but amplifies problems of purpose. You may already feel this paradox in your own life. The more comforts you accumulate, the more restless you become. The couch is soft, but your mind is itchy. The entertainment is endless, but you are bored. This is not a failure of willpower. It is the structure of the trap. Comfort satiates the body, but starves the spirit. It gives you everything you thought you wanted, and then whispers that something essential is missing. Left unchecked, this dynamic does not merely produce unhappy individuals, it reshapes entire cultures. Civilizations that lose their appetite for difficulty lose their capacity for greatness. History is full of examples. Empires that became decadent, citizens who traded liberty for bread and circuses, cultures that mistook leisure for vitality. Nietzsche's warning was that modernity might universalize this pattern, not as a cyclical decline, but as a permanent condition. The most haunting part of this scenario is its subtlety. No one forces you to choose comfort over growth. You do it yourself every day in small increments, and because each choice feels harmless, you hardly notice the cumulative effect. Only later do you realize you've been building a life perfectly designed to keep you from becoming who you might have been. This realization can be terrifying, but it is also clarifying. If the unseen consequence of comfort is the slow death of the self, then every moment of discomfort becomes a potential site of rebirth. Every time you choose the harder path, not recklessly but deliberately, you're resisting the drift toward mediocrity. You're practicing the art of self-overcoming that Nietzsche saw as the highest human calling. But to do this, you must first see the trap for what it is. You must recognize how comfort seduces you, not just at the level of habits, but at the level of identity, shaping the kind of person you become. You must realize that the price of perpetual ease is not merely boredom, but the erosion of your freedom, your resilience, and your sense of meaning. This is the pivot point. Once you see the unseen consequences, you face a choice: to continue drifting on the soft tide or to swim against it. Nietzsche's warning is not a prophecy of doom, but a call to arms, a reminder that the greatness of life lies not in the absence of struggle, but in the way you meet it. And so the question sharpens. If comfort breeds weakness, what does rebellion look like? What would it mean to live as an antidote to the last man, to build a life that strengthens rather than softens you? Rebellion begins quietly. It doesn't always look like protest or fire in the streets. Sometimes it looks like a single person choosing the harder path when an easier one is available. Sometimes it begins with a refusal to be pacified, a refusal to live anesthetized. Nietzsche never offered a 10-step plan for breaking free. What he offered was a posture, a stance toward life. He called it amor fati, the love of one's fate, including its pain. To rebel against comfort is to embrace reality without sedation. Imagine waking up tomorrow and treating discomfort not as an intruder, but as a teacher. The cold shower, the awkward conversation, the disciplined practice, the unglamorous work, all the things you've been avoiding become invitations. Each one is a chance to strengthen the will, to build what Nietzsche called the power to say yes to life. This is not masochism, it's training. Just as a muscle must be torn to grow, the soul must be tested to expand. The rebellion also requires a reimagination of values. In a world that rewards ease, you must privately reward effort. Instead of measuring success by how comfortable you are, measure it by how much you've grown. This is profoundly countercultural. It means redefining progress not as the elimination of struggle, but as the refinement of struggle. It means asking not, how can I avoid difficulty, but what kind of difficulty will make me more alive? History offers examples. The Stoics of ancient Rome practiced voluntary discomfort, fasting, sleeping on hard beds, rehearsing loss, not out of self-hatred, but to cultivate freedom from dependence. The Buddha left his palace of luxury to sit under a tree until he saw through the illusions of desire. Viktor Frankl, even in the camps, turned suffering into a forge for meaning. Each of these figures demonstrates a principle Nietzsche would have approved: the refusal to let comfort define the boundaries of one's being. In practical terms, rebellion might mean choosing to pursue mastery rather than mere competency, even when no one is watching. It might mean telling the truth when silence would be easier. It might mean taking on a physical discipline, a creative practice, or a spiritual ritual that demands effort without immediate reward. These acts are small but cumulative. They retrain your nervous system to associate difficulty with vitality rather than dread. There is also a psychological dimension. Carl Jung wrote that the avoidance of legitimate suffering is the root of neurosis. The more you flee discomfort, the more it haunts you in disguised forms: anxiety, resentment, emptiness. By contrast, when you voluntarily confront the difficult, you integrate parts of yourself you've been avoiding. You become more whole. This is rebellion at the deepest level, reclaiming the parts of yourself that comfort has allowed to wither. But rebellion is not only inward. A life built on courage rather than ease radiates outward. Families shaped by resilience rather than overprotection raise children who can withstand reality. Communities built around shared effort rather than shared consumption generate meaning. Even culture itself shifts when enough people quietly opt out of sedation and into engagement. The last man cannot survive if too many people refuse to be him. Nietzsche called for the creation of new values. Values born not from resentment, but from strength. In our time, this might mean celebrating patience in a culture of immediacy, depth in a culture of distraction, or discipline in a culture of indulgence. It might mean honoring those who build slowly, who endure, who dare to risk unpopularity for the sake of truth. Each time you do this, you're not just rebelling, you're creating a countercurrent, an alternative to the soft tyranny of comfort. Notice, too, the paradox. To truly rebel against comfort, you must do so without bitterness. If your rebellion is merely reactive, you're still defined by what you oppose. Nietzsche's ideal was the Übermensch, not a tyrant, but a self-create, or someone who turns even adversity into art. This requires a playful seriousness, a willingness to experiment with your own limits, to craft a life that feels like a sculpture rather than a shelter. This rebellion will look different for each person. For one, it might be leaving a secure but lifeless job to pursue a calling. For another, it might be staying in a difficult but meaningful situation rather than escaping at the first sign of pain. For still another, it might be as simple as turning off the screen, going outside, and confronting the rawness of unmediated reality. The point is not the specific act, but the principle: to choose growth over anesthesia. Every act of rebellion, however small, is a rehearsal for freedom. Each time you lean into discomfort voluntarily, you weaken the hold of the last man inside you. You begin to remember what it feels like to be alive in the full, risky sense of the word. The rebellion is not glamorous. It is daily, unbroadcasted, often invisible. But over time, it accumulates into a life with gravity, a life you can respect when you're alone with yourself. And this is where Nietzsche's warning transforms into an invitation. He was not trying to shame you for loving comfort. He was trying to wake you to the cost of it. He was not a prophet of doom, but a provocateur of potential. By rebelling against the culture of ease, you're not rejecting pleasure or progress, you're reclaiming the conditions under which real freedom, real joy, and real meaning become possible. Yet even rebellion is not the end. It is only the bridge. Beyond rebellion lies something deeper, a way of being that no longer alternates between comfort and discomfort, but transcends the dichotomy altogether. Nietzsche hinted at this, but left it for us to discover, the ultimate truth that makes struggle and ease parts of a larger whole. And so the question turns one law. Sex time. If rebellion is the way out of weakness, what is the way beyond rebellion? What is the ultimate realization that can transform not just your habits, but your vision of life itself? You've followed Nietzsche's warning from its first unsettling whisper to its deepest implications. You've seen how comfort can corrode the will, how it reshapes societies, and how rebellion can become a path to freedom. Yet all along, a deeper question has been hiding beneath the surface. If comfort is a trap and rebellion a way out, what lies beyond both? What is the horizon that Nietzsche hints at but rarely names? Imagine a mountain path. At first it is a brutal climb. Each step burns, the air thins, your muscles tremble. You rebel against your own limits, forcing yourself upward. But then, after a long ascent, you reach a plateau. The air is still thin but clear. The view opens. You are no longer merely fighting the mountain, you are moving with it. The struggle becomes not something to escape, but something you have absorbed, transformed. This is where rebellion matures into something greater: affirmation. Nietzsche called this amor fati, the love of fate. Not resignation, not stoic endurance, but love. To love fate is to stop seeing suffering as an obstacle and start seeing it as material. It is to take your life, with all its pains and comforts, and treat it as clay for sculpting. You cease to divide experiences into good and bad based on how easy they are. Instead, you ask only, can this too be used to grow? Even comfort, when chosen consciously rather than craved compulsively, becomes another tool. This is the ultimate truth hidden in Nietzsche's warning. The point is not to reject comfort, but to transcend its seduction. Comfort ceases to weaken you only when you no longer depend on it. When you have trained your will through chosen discomfort, you can then enjoy ease without being owned by it. You can sleep in a soft bed without losing your edge. You can use technology without becoming its subject. You can live in a wealthy society without becoming spiritually impoverished. It is the difference between possession and addiction. The last man is addicted to comfort. The free person possesses it without clinging. Rebellion is the detox, but amor fati is the integration, the moment when comfort and discomfort alike are welcomed as raw materials for a greater life. This is why Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch not as an ascetic, but as a creator. The goal is not self-denial, but self-mastery. Psychologically, this marks a profound shift. Instead of oscillating between indulgence and guilt, you inhabit a state of sovereignty. You can choose ease without shame, hardship without resentment. This is what Viktor Frankl glimpsed in the camps: the freedom to choose one's attitude even under extreme conditions. That freedom, once cultivated, remains yours in every circumstance. Philosophically, it reorients the meaning of struggle itself. Instead of seeing life as something to be endured until you can reach a painless state, you see it as an ongoing act of creation. Suffering becomes not a glitch in the system, but a vital element of it, like tension in a symphony, like contrast in a painting. Without it, the music would be flat, the image bland. Comfort ceases to be the enemy and becomes a color on your palette. This ultimate realization also alters your relationship to time. When you are seduced by comfort, you're always seeking the next moment of ease, living in anticipation. When you're lost in rebellion, you're always straining against the present, living in resistance. But when you affirm fate, you inhabit the present fully. Even pain becomes luminous because it is no longer something you're trying to escape. It is part of the texture of a life you've chosen to love. Practically, this means you no longer need to manufacture hardship just to feel alive. You don't have to seek cold showers or extreme sports as penance. Instead, you meet whatever life brings, ease or difficulty, with the same stance. This too is mine. This too can be used. You're free from the